The farmer never expected that an ordinary walk through his backyard would turn into a real sensation. He stumbled upon a strange giant object buried in the ground. At first, he thought it was just a stone, but the more he uncovered it, the more he realized this was something incredible. Very soon, scientists, journalists, and hundreds of curious people flocked to his home, and the discovery shocked everyone to the core. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun rose slowly above the horizon, spreading its pale golden light across the wide and quiet fields that stretched for miles in every direction. The air carried the earthy smell of damp soil and the faint sweetness of blooming grass. Birds darted between the trees that lined the edges of the property, their songs rising and falling in gentle harmony. It was the sort of morning that most people in cities would call idyllic. Yet, for Daniel, it was simply routine. Another day in the life he had inherited and shaped through years of labor. Daniel was a farmer, a man who carried in his body the marks of years bent over earth, lifting, hauling, mending, and building. His hands were calloused, his shoulders strong but often sore, and his face carried deep lines from sun and worry. He was a quiet man, the sort who believed that answers came not from endless words, but from the steady rhythm of work. His land was both a gift and a burden, one he had inherited from his late father, who had believed that soil, when treated with respect, could keep a family alive across generations. That morning, as he had countless others, Daniel rose before the sun had fully climbed into the sky. His house was modest, old but sturdy, with wooden floors that creaked when he moved across them. He made himself a simple breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, and black coffee, eaten in silence at the small wooden table near the kitchen window. Beyond the glass stretched acres of his fields still wet with dew. He drank his coffee slowly, staring at the land the way others might stare at a painting. For him, every row of earth, every fence post, every barn beam was familiar, almost intimate, yet he never forgot the weight of responsibility that came with it. The farm was his entire life, not only because it demanded his energy from dawn to dusk, but because it represented continuity. His father had died on this land, and his mother had once tended its chickens and garden. Memories clung to every corner of it. The sound of his father sharpening tools late at night, the smell of his mother's cornbread carried by the wind. Even after both were gone, those traces remained, and Daniel felt their presence whenever he walked across the fields or leaned against the weathered wood of the barn. The community around him was small, a scattering of farms, a town center with a grocery store, a gas station, a church, and a few shops. Neighbors were not far in miles, but far in habit. Everyone had their work, and everyone minded their own business unless called upon. That was the way of rural life. People spoke when they met in town, exchanged news about crops and weather, and sometimes gathered for Sunday services. But each returned to the private rhythm of their own farm. Daniel had grown used to solitude, not as loneliness, but as a fact of life, as natural as the wind or rain. When he stepped outside that morning, the sun warmed his face, and the air was cool enough to keep sweat at bay. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his worn cap, and began his usual circuit. The barn came first, its wide doors creaking open to reveal the cows waiting for feed, their eyes following him as he scattered hay. Chickens scratched impatiently at the dirt, clucking in the familiar chorus that filled the space. He checked the water troughs, tightened a hinge on the barn gate, and walked through the stalls, noting what needed repair or attention. These were the things he did without thinking, the movements ingrained into his body after years of repetition. After tending to the animals, Daniel set off to inspect the fields. The crops were in good shape that season, the soil moist from recent rains. Rows of corn reached upward, still young but sturdy. He bent to check the earth, running his fingers through the damp dirt. Farming was not only about brute labor, but about reading the subtle language of soil, sky, and growth. His father had taught him that long ago, saying that a good farmer never fights the land but listens to it, adjusting to its rhythm instead of forcing his own. Daniel walked further, beyond the fields and toward the line of trees that marked the beginning of the small ravine cutting across his property. This part of the land he seldom visited, except when chasing stray cattle or clearing brush. It was rocky and uneven, less useful for planting, but still part of his domain. Sometimes, after long days, he liked to wander here with his dog, enjoying the cool shade and the quiet that seemed different from the openness of the fields. That morning, however, he came alone, his mind restless, though his body followed its routine. Perhaps it was the particular stillness in the air, or the way the light slanted through the trees, but something drew him down the slope of the ravine. The soil was damp, dark from the previous night's rain, and as he moved carefully across it, his boots sank slightly with each step. The smell here was stronger, a mix of moss, wet earth, and decaying leaves. He paused near a slope where rocks jutted out unevenly. His eyes caught a glimpse of something unusual, something that at first his mind dismissed as a trick of the light. There, half buried in the soil and rock, was a curve, a shape that didn't quite belong to the natural angles of the ravine. He stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. It looked like part of a rounded surface, smooth where the dirt had been washed away, and covered elsewhere with mud and rust-colored patches. At first glance, it resembled a large stone, but as he approached, he realized it lacked the rough texture of rock. Instead, it reflected light faintly, as though it were made of something harder, denser, and less natural. His breath caught in his chest as he crouched to touch it. The surface felt cold under his hand, even though the sun had already warmed the air. He ran his fingers across it, surprised at its smoothness, as if it had been shaped or forged. He pulled his hand back, staring at the exposed curve. It was too even, too perfect in its roundness. Nature rarely made such shapes. The object protruded from the ground like the top of a buried sphere, a hemisphere peeking out from the earth as though waiting to be uncovered. A sudden shiver ran down his spine, though the air was still warm. Daniel straightened and looked around, as if expecting someone else to confirm what he was seeing. But there was only silence, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. The object remained, unyielding, indifferent to his shock. He stood there for several minutes, torn between curiosity and caution. Then, reluctantly, he turned away, climbing back up the slope and heading toward the house. Yet the image of that smooth, round surface stayed fixed in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. All day he tried to go about his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the ravine. The cows needed tending, the fences needed mending, but each task felt hollow, as though his mind were elsewhere. By evening, as he sat at his kitchen table eating dinner, he found himself staring into the distance, replaying the sight again and again. He could not explain why the discovery unsettled him, but it did. That night, lying in bed, Daniel closed his eyes, but sleep refused to come easily. Instead, he pictured the curve in the soil, the way his hand had felt against the cold surface, the strange, unnatural perfection of it. He thought of his father's words about the land, about how every field and ravine had its own history, its own secrets buried beneath the layers of soil. Perhaps this was one of those secrets. He rolled onto his side, pulling the blanket tighter, but even in the dark, the thought would not release him. The farm had always been predictable, its rhythms steady and familiar. But now, with that single discovery, Daniel felt a shift, a disturbance he could not yet define. What had seemed like an ordinary morning had left him with a sense of unease, as though something hidden beneath the earth had stirred awake and chosen him, of all people, to notice. And though he did not yet know it, this was only the beginning. Sleep had been restless, filled with half-formed dreams that vanished with the dawn, leaving only the lingering weight of unease behind Daniel's eyes. When the morning light crept through the curtains, he felt as though he had not truly slept at all, but rather drifted in and out of images he could not explain. The rounded shape in the ravine returned again and again in his mind, shining with the cold smoothness he had felt beneath his fingertips. He sat at the kitchen table with his breakfast untouched, staring out the window at the wide sweep of farmland, yet his thoughts were drawn inexorably to the shadows beyond the fields where the ravine lay. The chores of the farm called to him as they always did, but that morning he performed them with little attention. His body went through the motions while his mind pulled elsewhere. He fed the cows, scattered grain for the chickens, checked the water pumps, but none of it seemed real or urgent compared to what lay buried in the earth. By the time the sun rose higher, warming the wooden boards of the barn and drying the dew on the grass, he had already made up his mind to return. The object in the soil had unsettled him, but it had also awoken a strange, gnawing curiosity. He needed to see it again, to confirm that it had not been some trick of the light or imagination. When he descended into the ravine for the second time, the air was damp and heavy with the smell of moss and mud. The same birds circled overhead, their calls echoing faintly. He approached the slope where he had stood the day before, and there it was again, unchanged, silent, waiting. The earth still clung to its surface, but now, in the clearer morning light, he could see more details. The curve was smoother than any natural stone could be, and where the soil had cracked away he could glimpse patches that seemed almost polished. The rust-like stains that clung to parts of it looked like age, not accident, as though the thing had been buried there for decades, perhaps longer. Kneeling beside it, Daniel brushed away clumps of dirt with his hands. The soil fell away easily, revealing more of the cold, unyielding surface beneath. His fingertips tingled as he pressed against it, sensing its hardness, its refusal to give or crumble like stone. It was heavy, immovable, as though it extended deep into the ground. He circled the exposed section, trying to measure it with his eyes, but the curve suggested something far larger than what was visible. He stood back and wiped his brow, even though the morning was not yet hot. His heart beat faster than he wanted to admit. It was not only the strangeness of the object, but the questions it stirred. Who had placed it here? Or had it always been here, buried long before the farm was ever tilled, before his father had walked these fields, before any fence was raised? The thought unsettled him, yet it also sparked something else, a desire to know. All that day he returned to the spot in his mind, even when he forced himself back to the fields. He tried to work, plowing a section for planting, repairing a broken fence post, but his mind was elsewhere, circling around the image of the smooth curve rising out of the soil. By evening, he gave in to the pull. He fetched an old spade and a short-handled shovel from the shed, slung them over his shoulder, and walked once more into the ravine. The earth was soft from recent rains, and he set to work, pressing the shovel into the ground beside the exposed surface. Each thrust of the blade brought up clods of heavy soil that he tossed aside. At first, progress seemed possible, but soon the size of the thing revealed itself. No matter how much he dug, the curve continued, broad and seamless, suggesting a sphere or oval of great size. His arms ached, sweat gathered at his temples, and mud clung to his boots, but he persisted, driven by a need he could not explain. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the ravine, and Daniel realized he had been at it for hours. He leaned on the handle of the shovel, breathing heavily, staring at the section he had uncovered. It was larger now, enough to make it clear that this was no stone, no root, no ordinary debris. It was deliberate, shaped, perhaps even constructed. The surface gleamed faintly where he had cleared the soil, catching the last rays of daylight in a way that made it seem alive. That night, when he finally returned to the farmhouse, his body was sore and his hands raw from the work. He ate in silence, his appetite dulled by the weight of what he had seen. When darkness fell and the crickets began their chorus outside, he lay awake once again, staring at the ceiling, his mind turning over endless possibilities. He thought of his father, of the years spent walking this land, never speaking of anything unusual. Could it have lain there all this time, unnoticed, waiting? Morning came, and again he rose early, but now the farm felt different, as though the land itself had shifted beneath his feet. He felt watched, not by neighbors or passing cars, but by the very presence of the object in the earth. He tried to ignore it, tried to busy himself with chores, but his gaze always drifted toward the ravine. It was as though a magnet had taken hold of his thoughts, pulling them back to that buried curve no matter how he resisted. When he returned once more with his tools, he dug longer and harder, determined to free more of it. Hours stretched into an afternoon and the object revealed itself in pieces, never fully but always enough to suggest its enormity. 3 feet across, perhaps more, and still no end in sight. The soil clung stubbornly, and he fought against its weight, his muscles burning with the effort. He paused often to catch his breath, his shirt soaked through, but each time he looked at the shining surface, he felt compelled to continue. The ravine grew quieter as evening fell, the calls of birds fading into the distance. Only the sound of his shovel striking earth and the rasp of his own breathing filled the space. At last, exhausted, he sank down onto a fallen log, staring at the half-buried shape. His dog padded into the clearing then, tail wagging, sniffing at the ground around the strange object before circling back to sit at his feet. Daniel reached down absently to scratch behind its ears, but his gaze never left the curve of metal in the soil. He knew now that he could not ignore it. Whatever it was, it had claimed him. The farm that had once been steady and familiar had shifted around him, and in its place was a puzzle he could not set aside. Even as fatigue weighed on his limbs, he thought only of how he might continue tomorrow, of what tools he might need, of how deep this thing might run. The questions gnawed at him stronger than hunger or sleep. By the time he climbed back up the slope, the sky was painted with streaks of purple and red, the last light fading into darkness. He walked slowly to the farmhouse, his boots heavy with mud, his body aching, yet his mind alive with restless energy. Inside, he washed his hands in the sink, watching the brown water swirl away, but the dirt beneath his nails seemed to cling no matter how hard he scrubbed. He sat at the table with his untouched dinner, staring into space, replaying the day's labor and the glimpse of what still lay hidden below. Later, lying in bed, the night pressing in around him, Daniel closed his eyes and saw again the smooth, unbroken curve, the glimmer of light across its surface, the promise of something larger than himself. He could no longer pretend it was chance or coincidence. The land had revealed something to him, and whether he wanted it or not, it had become part of his life. Tomorrow he would return, and the day after that until he knew more. He did not know then how far this compulsion would lead him or how deeply it would alter the rhythm of his days. But already, as sleep finally overtook him, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. The object was no longer just something buried in the soil. It was a presence, a mystery, and it had already taken root in his mind like a seed destined to grow. The next morning broke with a gray haze across the sky, a thin mist rising from the damp earth as if the land itself were exhaling. Daniel awoke with the same restless energy that had haunted him the night before, a sense that he was being pulled toward the ravine as though it were a gravity he could not resist. His chores awaited. The animals needed tending, the fences needed checking, and yet all of that seemed secondary to the growing urgency in his chest. The object in the earth had taken hold of him, and now each hour away from it felt wasted. He tried to delay the inevitable, moving through the routine of the farm as though hoping the familiar rhythm might calm his mind. He scattered feed for the chickens, milked the cows with the practiced motions, and hauled water to the troughs. Yet, even as he worked, his thoughts drifted, circling back again and again to the smooth, cold surface he had uncovered. His body moved through the motions of farming, but his eyes kept wandering to the edge of the fields where the line of trees hid the ravine. Finally, he surrendered to the pull. Fetching his tools from the shed, he gathered not only the spade and shovel he had used before, but also a rusted pickaxe, its handle worn smooth by years of use. He loaded them into his old wheelbarrow, added a coil of rope and a crowbar for good measure, and began the slow walk toward the ravine. The wheelbarrow rattled along the uneven ground, its squeaking wheel punctuating the silence. When he descended the slope and stood once more before the half-buried curve, the sight of it filled him with a mixture of awe and dread. The morning mist clung to the earth and the object glistened faintly where the soil had been brushed away, as though it were sweating in the damp air. Daniel set down his tools and crouched to touch the surface again, his hand trembling slightly. The coldness of the metal seeped into his skin, steady and unyielding, and he drew in a deep breath before rising to begin his labor. He struck the earth with the shovel, loosening the soil around the exposed section, then heaved the clods aside. Sweat soon gathered on his brow despite the cool air, dripping into his eyes and mixing with the dirt on his face. He switched to the pickaxe when the soil grew dense with roots and rocks, the sharp crack of iron against stone echoing through the ravine. Piece by piece, he worked the earth away, and with each stroke more of the object revealed itself. Hours passed, the sun rising higher, burning away the mist. By midday, he had uncovered a section nearly 3 feet across, and still the curve extended deeper, broader, without end. The size of it stunned him. It was far larger than he had imagined, not a small relic or fragment, but something immense, as if the earth had swallowed an entire sphere and left only the crown visible. He paused often, leaning on his shovel, chest heaving with the effort, but each time his gaze fell on the shining surface he felt compelled to continue. By the time the afternoon shadows stretched long across the ravine, Daniel was covered in mud, his arms aching his back sore from bending and lifting. He dropped the shovel and sat heavily on a fallen log, staring at what he had uncovered. The surface was flawless, smooth in a way no natural stone could be, and unbroken even by the force of his pickaxe when he had struck it in frustration. It bore no seams, no cracks, nothing to suggest how it had been made or what purpose it might have served. The immensity of it overwhelmed him. He realized with a sinking heart that he could never hope to dig it out alone. The sheer weight of it, the way it seemed to root itself into the earth, made the task impossible. He felt suddenly small, insignificant before the silent presence of the object, as though it belonged to another world of time and scale. And yet, he could not walk away. Even in his exhaustion, his body heavy with fatigue, his mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it was an old tank, some relic from the war, buried and forgotten. Perhaps it was a piece of machinery, discarded by some long-gone company. Or perhaps, though he hated to admit it even to himself, it was something else entirely, something older than the farm, older even than the town. When he finally hauled himself to his feet and climbed back up the slope, his body protested with each step. The wheelbarrow clattered behind him as he dragged it home, his muscles burning, but his eyes never left the ground ahead, lost in thought. He washed himself in the basin outside the farmhouse, the water turning brown as it ran off his arms. But even as he scrubbed the dirt away, he felt the weight of the day clinging to him. That evening, he sat on the porch with his dog at his side, watching the sun sink low over the fields. The land looked the same as it always had, quiet, steady, timeless, and yet he knew it was not the same. Beneath its surface, hidden for who knew how long, lay something that defied explanation. He wondered how many times his father had walked those fields, how many times he himself had passed by without noticing, while the secret lay waiting just below his feet. Sleep came even harder that night. He lay awake, muscles throbbing from the day's labor, staring into the darkness while his mind replayed the sound of the shovel striking earth, the glimmer of light across the metal surface, the endless curve that seemed to grow larger the more he uncovered it. He felt as though he had touched something that was never meant to be disturbed, and yet he knew he could not stop. Tomorrow, he promised himself he would return with more strength, more tools, more determination. Days bled into one another, each marked by the same pattern. He would tend to his animals, repair what needed mending, and then descend into the ravine to dig. His hands blistered, his shoulders stiffened, but still he labored, peeling back the layers of earth as though he were uncovering the hidden history of the land itself. The object revealed itself only reluctantly, as though it resented being disturbed, and yet each new patch of surface only deepened his obsession. Neighbors began to notice. A passing truck slowed to watch him at work one afternoon, the driver leaning out the window with curiosity. Others saw him hauling dirt in the wheelbarrow, sweat dripping from his face, and wondered what he was digging for. Rumors began to drift through the small town, whispers of treasure, of madness, of secrets buried on the old farm. Daniel ignored them, focused only on the silent task that consumed his days. He no longer thought of it as simply an object. To him, it had become a presence, a silent companion that demanded his attention. The farm he had once known as predictable and steady now seemed like a veil, behind which something vast and incomprehensible lay hidden. And he, by chance or by fate, had been the one to lift that veil. By the end of the week, his body was worn thin, yet his determination had only grown. He knew he could not continue alone, not forever. The object was too large, too deeply embedded in the earth. He needed more hands, more knowledge, more strength than his own. The realization settled in him like a heavy stone. He would have to seek help. As he sat once more on the porch that evening, watching the shadows creep across the fields, Daniel felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had discovered something extraordinary, something that tied him to the land in ways he could not yet understand. And now, if he chose to share it, he would no longer be the only one to bear its mystery. The farm would never be the same, and deep down, he knew neither would he. By the time the 4th week passed, Daniel had exhausted every ounce of strength he could give to the earth that shielded the mysterious object. His body bore the marks of his obsession. Calluses had hardened into thick ridges on his palms, his back ached constantly, and his nights were restless, spent tossing and turning with visions of the buried shape filling his mind. No matter how much he dug, the object never seemed to end. It mocked his efforts, its vastness greater than one man's strength, and for the first time since he had uncovered it, Daniel admitted to himself that he could go no further alone. The thought of reaching out for help sat uneasily within him. He had never been a man to lean on others. Farming demanded self-reliance. It was a life that punished weakness and rewarded persistence. Yet this was no broken fence or failing tractor. This was something else entirely. Something beyond his ability to explain or manage. The decision came late one evening as he sat on the porch, staring at the horizon with the dog at his feet. The sun had set, and the air was filled with the buzz of cicadas. He thought of his father, of the old lessons about responsibility, about how a man had to face the burdens placed before him. But this burden was not his alone to carry. It was larger than him, larger than the farm, perhaps larger than the whole town. He realized reluctantly that the time had come to call someone who might understand. The next morning, he drove into town in his pickup truck, its engine rattling down the familiar road. The town center was quiet, as it always was on a weekday morning. A few cars sat parked near the diner, the grocery store's windows reflected the bright sky, and the post office flag rippled in the light breeze. Daniel pulled up in front of the college annex, a small brick building where a handful of local professors and researchers kept offices. He had known one of them, a geologist named Mark Harris, for years. Mark was younger, sharp-minded, the sort who could spend hours speaking of rock strata and soil layers with the same passion other men reserved for baseball or politics. Daniel had always respected his curiosity, even if he did not share it. When Mark agreed to come out to the farm, he did so with the polite skepticism of a man accustomed to exaggerated claims. He arrived a few days later in a dusty sedan, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with notebooks and tools. His handshake was firm, his eyes curious but reserved. Daniel led him across the fields without delay, avoiding unnecessary words, the dog trotting at their heels. The air was heavy with late summer heat, and sweat glistened on their brows as they descended into the ravine. When Mark first laid eyes on the exposed section of the object, his expression shifted from polite detachment to genuine astonishment. He crouched, brushing the surface with his fingertips, then pulled a small geological hammer from his bag and tapped gently against the curve. The sound that echoed back was unlike stone. It was deeper, denser, a metallic resonance that made Daniel's skin prickle. Mark muttered under his breath, jotting notes in a small pad, then asked Daniel how much he had uncovered. Daniel explained, gesturing to the edges of the excavation, his voice low and steady, though inside he felt the nervous energy of a man revealing a secret too heavy to keep. Mark listened carefully, measuring sections with a tape, pressing a handheld spectrometer to the surface, and frowning at the readings. At first, he suggested it might be a large industrial tank, perhaps buried decades ago when the land had been used differently. But as he circled the exposed curve, his skepticism began to falter. The symmetry was too precise, the surface too unblemished despite its age, and the sheer size of it defied any ordinary explanation. The day stretched into hours as Mark worked. He chipped at nearby soil, examined root patterns, and took small samples of the metal, though each chip resisted his tools. The object was tougher than anything he expected, impervious to simple strikes, as though designed to withstand centuries. Daniel watched in silence, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched, every moment confirming what he had already felt in his bones. This was not something natural, and it was not something he could dismiss. By evening, when the light began to fade and the shadows deepened in the ravine, Mark finally stood, dusting dirt from his knees. His face was drawn, his expression unsettled. He admitted he could not explain what it was. It did not fit any category he knew. Not stone, not standard steel, not any industrial remnant he could identify. He speculated it could be some kind of abandoned prototype, perhaps military, perhaps experimental, but each word sounded more like grasping than certainty. Daniel listened without speaking, his eyes fixed on the smooth curve that gleamed faintly in the dim light. He knew, as surely as he knew the rhythm of his land, that this was no ordinary relic. Mark's words confirmed what his own instincts had already told him. The object was something beyond their immediate understanding. When Mark finally packed his tools and promised to return with colleagues, Daniel felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that he was no longer alone in carrying the mystery, dread that once others became involved, the quiet of his life would be gone forever. The following week, more men arrived. They came with equipment, cameras, measuring instruments, and notebooks. They spoke in technical terms, argued among themselves, and scribbled diagrams. Some leaned toward the idea of it being an industrial storage sphere. Others speculated on remnants of Cold War technology, while a few whispered about older origins, as if the object predated even the history of the town. Daniel stood on the slope above them, watching their movements with the stillness of a man out of place in his own land. The ravine, once a private corner of his farm, had transformed into a site of investigation. The presence of these specialists unsettled him. Their voices broke the silence he had grown accustomed to. Their equipment scarred the soil. Their eager discussions contrasted sharply with his own quiet respect for the object. To them, it was a puzzle to be solved, a project to publish, a curiosity that might bring them recognition. To Daniel, it was something deeper, something tied to the land itself, a secret that had chosen to reveal itself to him first. He felt possessive, protective, even as he knew he could not hold it to himself forever. At night, he sat on his porch as before, watching the fireflies rise from the grass and listening to the distant hum of insects. Yet now the peace felt broken. He thought of the strangers in the ravine, of their voices echoing in the place that had once been his solitude. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if, by calling them, he had unleashed something he could no longer contain. But it was too late for doubts. The secret was no longer his alone. It belonged to anyone who came to see it, to touch it, to speculate on its meaning. Still, even as he wrestled with unease, Daniel knew he could not have done otherwise. He had reached the limits of his strength, and the object demanded more than one man could give. It demanded knowledge, skill, tools beyond his reach. Whether he liked it or not, the mystery had stepped out of the shadows and into the world. He could only watch as it grew beyond him, as the quiet balance of his life was replaced by something larger, something he could neither predict nor control. And though he returned to his bed each night, closing his eyes against the weight of it, he understood that he had crossed a threshold. The life he had known, the simple cycles of soil, seed, and harvest, was gone. In its place stood the promise of revelation and the threat of disruption, bound together in the silent, unyielding curve of metal that slept beneath his land. Word spread faster than Daniel could have imagined. At first, it was only the specialists who came, a handful of geologists and engineers with their measuring instruments and careful theories, but soon the story seeped beyond the quiet borders of the farm. One of the younger men who had accompanied Mark returned to town and spoke of what he had seen in the ravine, and before long whispers reached the diner, the barber shop, and the grocery store. The whispers turned into conversations, the conversations into rumors, and within days the small community that had always minded its own business was suddenly consumed by speculation. Daniel felt the shift almost immediately. Trucks he did not recognize began to appear along the dirt road that led past his property. Strangers slowed to stare at the fields, some bold enough to pull over and step out, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ravine. A few approached him directly, asking questions with eager faces, their voices bright with excitement or suspicion. What had he found? Was it treasure? Was it dangerous? Was it even real? Daniel met them with the same steady silence he had carried all his life, his answers clipped and unrevealing, but his reserve only seemed to feed the fire. The less he said, the more others imagined. Within a week, a local reporter appeared at his doorstep, a young woman with a camera slung over her shoulder and a notepad in her hand. She spoke quickly, her words spilling out as she explained that the town deserved to know what had been uncovered, that people were curious, that a story like this could not stay hidden. Daniel had no interest in speaking, but she persisted, asking to see the ravine, promising that she would not take photographs without his permission. Against his better judgment, he led her down the familiar slope, his dog trotting behind as always. The moment her eyes fell on the exposed curve of metal, her face lit up with the thrill of discovery, and Daniel felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He realized then that he could no longer keep this secret contained. The newspaper article appeared the following Sunday, accompanied by a grainy photograph of the object partially buried in soil, its surface glinting faintly in the sun. The headline was bold, designed to catch the eye: "Farmer's Field Yields Mysterious Find." The article described the discovery in breathless detail, quoting anonymous sources, speculating wildly on its origins. By the next morning, Daniel's quiet life had dissolved into chaos. Cars lined the road, people crowded at the edges of his property, voices rose in eager chatter as groups gathered to peer into the ravine. Some carried cameras, others sketch pads, still others simply stood and stared, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. At first, Daniel tried to tolerate it. He watched from the porch as strangers wandered near the fences, pointing and arguing among themselves. He told himself it would pass, that curiosity would fade, that people would return to their lives once the novelty wore off. But the days stretched into weeks, and the crowd only grew. News outlets arrived from beyond the town, bringing with them bright lights and intrusive questions. Television crews set up equipment at the edge of the fields, their voices echoing into microphones as they spoke of the strange discovery in the heart of rural America. Daniel felt the invasion in every corner of his life. The porch, where he once sat in peace, now overlooked a steady stream of vehicles. The fields, once his private domain, now carried the footprints of outsiders who trampled the soil without thought. Even the nights were disturbed, as some lingered after dark with flashlights, eager to glimpse the object by moonlight. The farm that had always been his refuge had become a spectacle. The questions gnawed at him as much as the presence of the crowds. Some visitors accused him outright of staging the discovery, of planting something to draw attention, of seeking profit from the chaos. Others insisted he was hiding the truth, that he knew more than he was saying. There were whispers of treasure, of old weapons, of secrets buried by the government. Each theory seemed wilder than the last, and each carried with it a tone of suspicion that cut at Daniel's pride. He had never sought recognition, never craved fame or attention, and now he found himself the unwilling center of a storm. Inside the house, he moved through the rooms with a heaviness he had never known before. The windows no longer looked out upon familiar, comforting scenes, but onto crowds and flashing lights. He avoided the porch, avoided the road, even avoided the fields when he could. Only the ravine remained what it had always been, a place where he could stand in silence before the unyielding curve of metal and feel, if only for a moment, that the noise of the world above had not yet reached it. And yet, even there, he was not alone. Specialists returned with increasing frequency, setting up temporary equipment, stringing cables, placing markers in the soil. They spoke in clipped technical language, their conversations sharp with disagreement. Some claimed the object was a relic of mid-20th century engineering, perhaps a prototype storage tank or a component of a long-forgotten machine. Others argued that its composition did not match any known alloy from that era. They took samples, ran tests, and argued bitterly over the results, each theory clashing against the others with no resolution. Daniel listened from the sidelines, his arms folded, his jaw set. He felt alien in his own land, a witness to a battle of speculation that meant little to him. To the specialist, the object was a prize, a challenge, a potential key to recognition or advancement. To the crowds, it was entertainment, a story to tell. But to him, it was something quieter and deeper, a secret the earth had chosen to reveal to him and him alone, long before the others had come with their cameras and machines. He felt a possessive ache when he thought of it, as though it had been taken from him, transformed into a curiosity rather than the solemn mystery he had first encountered. The farm suffered under the weight of his distraction. The animals grew restless when strangers lingered too close to the barns. The crops were left untended, weeds creeping in along the edges of the fields. Daniel noticed the decline with a pang of guilt, but no matter how he tried, he could not split his attention between the work of the land and the constant intrusion of the discovery. The balance of his life had been broken, and no amount of effort could restore it. One evening, after a long day of questions and clamor, Daniel retreated to the ravine as dusk fell. The crowds had thinned at last, the specialists packed up their equipment for the night, and silence crept back over the land. He sat on the log where he had often rested after hours of digging, his dog pressed close to his side. The object gleamed faintly in the fading light, unchanged and indifferent to all the turmoil it had caused. Daniel stared at it, his thoughts heavy. He wondered what his father would have said, what wisdom the old man might have offered if he were still alive. Perhaps he would have told him that some things are better left buried, that not every secret is meant to be uncovered. But Daniel knew there was no turning back. The world had seen what lay in the earth, and the world would not let it go. The object had become more than a mystery of soil and metal. It had become a spectacle, a battleground of opinions, a source of noise that consumed the peace of his life. He sat there until the last traces of light disappeared, the stars pricking the sky above, and felt the weight of inevitability press down upon him. His farm was no longer his alone. It had been claimed by something larger, something he could not stop, something that had drawn the eyes of the world to a quiet ravine where once only he and his dog had walked. And as he rose at last and made his way back to the farmhouse, the voices of the crowd still echoed faintly in the distance, carried on the night air. They did not belong to him, nor to his land, but they would not leave. The noise had become part of his life, and he could only brace himself for what would come next. The weeks that followed were a blur of constant interruption. What had begun as whispers in town and scattered visitors on the roadside had become an unending stream of strangers, specialists, and self-proclaimed experts. Daniel had once lived by the rhythm of the seasons, his days dictated by sun and soil. But now time was marked by the arrival of cars, the thrum of generators, and the chatter of voices that had no place on his land. The ravine no longer belonged to him. It had been transformed into a stage where arguments and experiments unfolded, while he stood on the edges, both participant and bystander in a story he had never chosen to tell. The specialists came with equipment that seemed more suited to laboratories than to fields. Heavy cases were carried down into the ravine, laid open like treasure chests, revealing scanners, drills, and strange devices that hummed with electricity. Men in work boots and women with notebooks bent over the object, their hands brushing its cold surface as if hoping to coax out its secrets. They spoke in clipped tones, their words littered with technical terms that Daniel could barely follow. Sometimes they argued, voices rising in frustration, as they struggled to fit the object into a framework of understanding that seemed always just out of reach. Daniel watched them with a detached unease. He had invited the first geologist, yes, but he had not asked for this invasion of scholars and journalists, each eager to lay claim to the mystery. He stood with arms folded, his dog pressed against his leg, listening as they explained their theories. Some insisted it was a relic of Cold War engineering, perhaps an experimental container buried and forgotten by the military. They gestured to its size, its seamless surface, and the resilience that resisted even the sharpest drills. Others scoffed, pointing out that no military archive, no record, no blueprint matched such a design. They suggested instead that it was industrial, perhaps the remains of some failed technology from a factory that had once operated nearby. But the alloys they tested defied easy classification. Too strong, too resistant, aged in ways that did not make sense. One afternoon, Daniel watched as two men argued so fiercely that their voices echoed off the ravine walls. One brandished a clipboard, insisting that the readings proved it was no older than a few decades. The other, a pale and bespectacled man, countered that the patina of corrosion spoke of centuries, perhaps longer. Their words collided, angry and impatient, until both fell silent and stared once more at the gleaming curve that answered none of their questions. The silence that followed felt heavier than the argument itself, for it carried the weight of ignorance, of knowledge that refused to yield. Daniel did not join their debates. He did not trust their certainty, nor their eagerness to box the object into theories. To him, the object was not an academic puzzle, but a presence, something older and deeper than the tidy explanations they tried to offer. He remembered the first time he had seen it, half buried in mud, the way it had glistened under his hand. That quiet awe had never left him, and though the others came with machines and theories, he knew none of them felt it as he did. For them, it was a discovery. For him, it was an intrusion into the very bones of the land. The noise grew with every passing day. More cars arrived, more cameras flashed. The ravine became a place of constant disruption, its silence broken by drilling, hammering, the low hum of machines taking readings that produced nothing but confusion. Some nights, Daniel sat on his porch and watched the faint glow of floodlights still burning down by the slope, their beams cutting through the darkness as the specialists worked long into the hours when decent men should have been at rest. He longed for the time when the ravine had been a place of solitude, when only his footsteps and the panting of his dog disturbed its shadows. That world felt lost now, and the weight of it pressed down on him. Despite all their efforts, no answers came. Each test contradicted the last. One day, the specialists announced triumphantly that they had identified traces of steel mixed with nickel, proof of a human origin. 2 days later, another team returned with results suggesting that the density was far greater than any known alloy, the kind of resilience that factories could not produce. Reports conflicted, data clashed, and theories dissolved into frustration. The only thing they agreed on was that the object was unlike anything they had expected. The uncertainty only fueled the frenzy beyond the farm. Newspapers published new articles, each with bold claims about the mysterious sphere buried in a farmer's land. Television crews returned, their anchors speaking with excitement about the unexplained phenomenon shaking a small rural town. People arrived from farther away now, traveling hours just to stand at the roadside and peer through binoculars at the excavation. Some believed it was evidence of government secrets, others whispered of buried treasure, still others spun tales of ancient civilizations. Daniel listened to none of it, but he could not shut it out. The noise pressed in from all sides, and no corner of his farm was safe from the intrusion. The intrusion seeped into his own life in quieter, sharper ways as well. The crops were neglected, weeds rising higher than they should have. The animals grew restless, uneasy with the constant commotion of strangers near their pens. Bills piled up, chores went undone, and Daniel found himself caught between the need to protect the land and the relentless pull of the discovery. He spent more time standing by the ravine than working his fields, watching with a helpless frustration as his farm slipped out of balance. At night, when the crowds had gone and the specialists had packed away their tools, Daniel descended into the ravine alone. He would crouch by the object, his hand pressed against its cold surface, feeling the steady resistance of something immovable. He whispered no words, offered no prayers, but in those moments he felt as though he were in the presence of something vast and inscrutable, a reminder of how small he was in the scale of time. The object had existed long before him, long before the farm, perhaps long before the town itself. And it would remain long after he was gone, silent and unyielding. He wondered then why it had revealed itself to him, why he had been the one to see it first, the one to uncover its surface with trembling hands. The thought comforted and haunted him in equal measure. It was his discovery, yet it had been taken from him. The world now circled it like vultures, feeding on its mystery, while he was left with the knowledge that it had once been his alone. The weeks turned to months, and still no explanation satisfied. Reports contradicted, specialists rotated in and out, journalists arrived and departed, but the object remained the same, impervious and indifferent. Daniel realized at last that the truth might never come, that the earth would keep its secret no matter how deeply men dug or how many machines they brought to bear. It was a bitter realization, but also a freeing one. He stopped listening to their theories, stopped seeking their answers. Instead, he returned to his work, to the rhythm of the land, accepting that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. And yet, even as he tried to return to the life he had known, the object remained a weight in his mind. Each morning, as he walked his fields, his gaze drifted toward the ravine. Each night, as he closed his eyes, he saw the glimmer of light across the metal curve. He could not escape it, no matter how hard he tried. It had bound itself to him, not with answers, but with questions that would never be resolved. The specialists would come and go, the journalists would write their stories and move on. The crowds would eventually tire of their curiosity. But for Daniel, the object was not a spectacle or a puzzle. It was a truth buried in the soil, silent and immovable, a reminder that the land he tilled and the life he lived were a part of something far greater than he could ever comprehend. And in that truth lay both his burden and his peace. Autumn crept across the fields while the object in the ravine remained unmoved, unyielding, and as mysterious as the day Daniel first laid eyes on it. Weeks of speculation had led to nothing conclusive. The specialists had drifted away one by one, their instruments packed, their notebooks filled with theories that contradicted one another. The floodlights no longer burned through the night. The hum of machines had stilled, and the din of voices that had once filled the ravine faded into silence. Even the journalists stopped coming, their cameras turned toward fresher stories, leaving behind only rumors and unanswered questions. The farm, however, did not return to what it had been before. The soil still bore the scars of heavy boots and machinery, the grass along the ravine was trampled flat, and deep gouges in the earth marked the places where men had driven stakes and dragged cables. Daniel walked there often, studying the signs of intrusion with a quiet heaviness in his chest. He longed for the days when it had been his alone, when the curve of metal had lain half-hidden in silence, waiting patiently beneath the soil. Those days were gone, and he knew they would not return. The object itself had not changed. Despite drills and hammers, despite soil samples and endless tests, it had resisted all attempts to be moved or explained. It seemed to belong more to the earth than to the men who had tried to disturb it, and Daniel began to see that as fitting. Whatever it was, whatever history it carried, it was not meant to be extracted or claimed. It had rested in the ground for longer than anyone could imagine, and it would remain there long after the last curious visitor had gone. Daniel accepted this with a strange kind of peace. The burden of questions no longer pressed as heavily upon him. He no longer waited for answers from men who spoke too quickly and argued too loudly. He no longer flinched when strangers offered wild explanations or accused him of deception. He had come to understand that the truth was not his to know. The object was not a problem to be solved, but a fact of existence, something as immovable and eternal as the hills themselves. His days slowly returned to the rhythm he had once known. He rose with the sun, fed the animals, worked the fields, repaired the fences. The land required his attention, and he gave it gladly, feeling again the satisfaction of honest labor. Yet, even as he sank into the comfort of routine, the presence of the object lingered. Each time he passed near the ravine, he felt its silent weight beneath his feet, a reminder that the land he farmed was deeper and older than his own small life. Sometimes, in the cool of evening, he would walk to the ravine and sit upon the fallen log where he had so often rested. The dog would settle at his feet, ears pricked, eyes watching the shadows. Daniel would sit in silence, gazing at the curve of metal that caught the last rays of sunlight before night fell. He no longer thought of uncovering it further, no longer dreamed of hauling it free of the soil. Instead, he let it remain where it was, half buried, half revealed, a secret shared between the earth and himself. He thought often of his father during those moments. He imagined the old man's voice, calm and steady, reminding him that the land carried more than crops and cattle. It carried memory, it carried time, it carried secrets that no man could claim. His father had walked these fields for decades, never once speaking of anything unusual, yet Daniel could not help but wonder if he had sensed it too, if he had felt the same subtle pull when he passed the ravine. Perhaps the land revealed itself only when it chose to, and perhaps it had chosen him. The neighbors still spoke of it sometimes, their voices carrying fragments of rumor and speculation when he encountered them in town. Some insisted it was nothing but a buried tank, a relic of careless industry. Others whispered more fanciful tales, speaking of hidden powers or ancient civilizations. Daniel listened politely when he had to, but he offered no opinions of his own. What he thought of the object was not something he could put into words, nor something he cared to share. It belonged to him in a way that no story or explanation could alter. As the season deepened, the crowds thinned entirely. The roadside grew quiet again, the fields empty except for the usual passage of tractors and cattle. Daniel cherished the return of silence. At night, the stars shone undisturbed overhead, their light clear and steady. The hum of voices was gone, replaced once more by the sounds of crickets, of wind rustling through the trees, of the lowing of cattle in the barn. Life had settled again, not quite as it had been before, but close enough to bring him comfort. And yet, he was not the same man he had been. The discovery had changed him, not through knowledge, but through perspective. He had been reminded that the land he worked was layered with history far deeper than the furrows of his plow. Beneath every step lay centuries, perhaps millennia, of stories untold, lives forgotten, mysteries beyond the reach of memory. The object in the ravine was only one such reminder, but it was enough. It had opened his eyes to the scale of time, to the truth that his farm, his labor, his life were part of something vaster than he could grasp. One evening, as the last leaves fell and the air grew sharp with the promise of winter, Daniel stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down at the silent curve of metal. The setting sun cast it in a faint golden glow, and for a moment it looked alive, as though breathing with the earth itself. He felt no fear, no confusion, only a quiet reverence. He knew he would never uncover it fully, never hold its secrets in his hands, and he no longer needed to. Its presence was enough. It had taught him what it came to teach, that the world was full of mysteries not meant to be solved, only witnessed, respected, and remembered. He turned away at last, walking slowly back toward the farmhouse, the dog at his side, the land stretching out around him in the fading light. The fields lay ready for winter, the barns stood waiting, the fences traced their steady lines across the hills. Life, in all its ordinary weight, continued. Yet, beneath it all, beneath the soil and stone, something greater endured, silent and steadfast, a symbol of the depth of time. For the rest of his life, whenever he walked past the ravine, Daniel would glance at the buried curve and feel that same quiet stirring in his chest. It was no longer an intrusion, no longer a burden, but a reminder that the land was not only his to farm, but his to keep in trust. Beneath its surface lay the truths of ages, and though he could not uncover them, he could honor them. The object would remain there, half seen, half hidden, a testament to the mysteries that dwell in the earth, waiting for those willing to look and willing to leave them be. And so Daniel lived on, his farm steady under his care, his days filled once more with the labor he knew. But the memory of that first morning, when he had brushed aside the soil and felt the cold smoothness beneath his hand, never left him. It was a moment that lived in his mind as surely as any harvest, any season, any day of toil. A moment that reminded him of the vastness of the world and his small but sacred place within it. The object had not given him answers, but it had given him something greater: perspective, humility, and a deeper reverence for the land that sustained him. And that, he understood at last, was enough. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable stories coming soon. Click now to watch more of our jaw-dropping videos, each one more shocking than the last. And if this story amazed you, share it with your friends and family. They won't believe it until they see it.